My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 34 years old. I have a decent apartment in Austin, Texas, a used but reliable Honda Civic, a savings account I'm actually proud of, and a credit score that took me 6 brutal years to rebuild from the absolute bottom. I have a dog named Biscuit, a small collection of houseplants I somehow haven't killed yet, and a morning routine that keeps me sane. By most measures, my life looks okay now. Maybe even good. But there was a period, a specific Tuesday afternoon in October 2018, when everything I thought I understood about my family, about trust, about the word father, got ripped out from underneath me like a tablecloth from a set table. Everything fell. Everything shattered. And I was left standing there, holding a phone to my ear, listening to a stranger tell me that I owed $290,000. I didn't owe that money. I had never borrowed it. I had never signed for it. I had never even heard of the account. But my name was on it, my social security number, my date of birth, my signature, or something that looked like my signature, and the man on the other end of the phone, a collections agent from a firm called Meridian Capital Recovery. He didn't want to hear any of that. He just wanted to know when I was going to start making payments. To understand how I ended up here, I have to take you back. Not all the way to the beginning, because this story has roots that go deeper than I can fully excavate, but far enough back that you can see the shape of things. Far enough back that you understand who my father was, or at least who I believed him to be. Before that Tuesday in October changed everything. My father's name is Robert Mercer. He grew up in a small town in rural Ohio, the youngest of 4 brothers, the son of a mechanic who believed that the only things worth a man's time were hard work, silence, and pride. My grandfather, Raymond Mercer, was not a cruel man, but he was not a soft one either. He didn't talk about feelings. He talked about fixing things. He talked about keeping your head down and your chin up, and never, ever letting anyone see you sweat. He passed those values to his sons like heirlooms, and my father received them faithfully. By the time my father was in his mid-20s, he had built a small electrical contracting business in Columbus, Ohio. He started it with $1,400, a truck he'd bought for $800 at a police auction, and a contact list of 3 people. Within 5 years, Mercer Electric had 6 full-time employees, a fleet of 2 vans, and a reputation in the area for doing clean, honest work on time. My father was proud of that. He was the kind of proud that doesn't say much out loud but shows up in everything. In the way he stood a little straighter when someone mentioned his company name, in the way he kept the invoices in a perfectly organized filing cabinet, in the way he never once allowed a payment to be late. He met my mother, Patricia, at a church fundraiser in 1985. She was 22, he was 27. They married 8 months later. My older sister Karen was born in 1987. I came along in 1990. We grew up in a 4-bedroom house in Dublin, Ohio, which in the 90s was already transitioning from a quiet suburb into something more ambitious, more expensive, more competitive. My father's business grew with it. By the time I was in middle school, Mercer Electric had 14 employees and was doing commercial contracts, schools, small office buildings, a couple of apartment complexes. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. More than comfortable. We went on vacations, we had new cars, my sister and I had our own rooms, our own computers, our own sense that the world was basically a manageable place. I worshipped my father when I was young. I think most kids do, or at least the lucky ones do, the ones whose fathers are present and functional. But I had specific reasons. He was competent in a way that felt almost supernatural to me as a child. He could fix anything. He knew how things worked. Not just electrical things, but all things. He could read a room, read a situation, read a contract. He had an authority about him that wasn't loud or aggressive, just quietly certain. When my father said something was going to be fine, it was fine. When he said something was a bad idea, it was a bad idea. His judgment felt like weather, real, reliable, not something you argued with. The first crack appeared when I was 20. I didn't recognize it as a crack at the time. I thought it was just stress, just a rough patch, just one of those seasons in a business's life when things get tight. It was 2010, and the country was still crawling out of the wreckage of 2008. Construction had slowed dramatically. New commercial projects had dried up. My father's business, which had been built largely on new construction contracts, was hurting. He let 2 employees go in January, 3 more in March. He told us at dinner one night that things were going to be lean for a while, that we needed to be smart, that he had it handled. He said it the way he always said things, calmly, certainly, as if the outcome had already been decided, and he was just briefing us on the details. I was a sophomore at Ohio State. I had a partial scholarship, a part-time job at a campus bookstore, and no real understanding of what my father's business actually looked like from a financial standpoint. I knew we were tightening belts. I switched from a meal plan to cooking most of my own food. I picked up extra shifts at the bookstore. I told myself I was contributing, doing my part, helping the family through a rough patch. My father never asked me to do any of this. But I did it because it felt right, because it felt like what a Mercer did. You handled your business, you kept your head down, you didn't complain. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my father had taken out a home equity line of credit against our family home in 2009. The house was worth, at that point, roughly $380,000. He had borrowed $120,000 against it. He used that money to keep the business running, to make payroll, to cover equipment leases and insurance premiums, and all the thousand invisible expenses that keep small business alive when the revenue side collapses. He didn't tell my mother. He didn't tell anyone. He signed the paperwork alone, put the documents in a filing cabinet, and kept moving. This was the first secret. This was the first brick removed from the foundation that I had spent my entire childhood believing was solid. I graduated from Ohio State in May 2012 with a degree in business administration and $41,000 in student loan debt. I moved back home for 4 months while I job hunted, which was humbling in the way that moving back home at 22 always is. My father's business had stabilized somewhat. The construction market was recovering. He'd landed a couple of decent contracts. But the house felt different, quieter. My parents' interactions had a careful quality to them that I hadn't noticed growing up but couldn't ignore as an adult. They were polite to each other in the way that people are polite when the alternative is fighting, and neither of them wanted to fight. I got a job in September 2012 at a mid-sized property management company in Columbus. Entry level, $41,000 a year, benefits included. I moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in the Short North neighborhood and started building my adult life with the focused, slightly desperate energy of someone who had been waiting a long time to start. I paid my bills on time. I built up a small emergency fund. I opened a Roth IRA because I'd read 3 personal finance books in college, and I believed genuinely that I was going to be responsible in ways that the previous generation hadn't always been. I was proud of myself in a quiet way. I felt like I was doing it right. Between 2012 and 2017, I saw my parents regularly. Holidays, occasional weekends, a family vacation in 2014 to the Outer Banks that felt, in retrospect, like an attempt to pretend that everything was still normal. My father's business continued to operate, but it never fully recovered its pre-recession size or confidence. He was down to 8 employees by 2015. He was doing more residential work, which he'd always considered beneath him, because the commercial contracts weren't coming back the way he'd hoped. He was 60 years old and running a company that felt like it was slowly, quietly losing altitude. I noticed things. Tension when certain topics came up, a vagueness about finances that hadn't been there when I was a child. Once, During a Sunday dinner in 2016, my mother mentioned that the furnace had gone out and asked my father when he was going to call someone, and he said he was handling it, and she said she'd been hearing that for 3 weeks, and the silence that followed was so dense I could feel it pressing against my skin. But I didn't ask. I was a Mercer. You didn't ask. You assumed the person responsible was handling it. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. You trusted the patriarch. In early 2017, I was promoted to a senior property management role, and my salary went up to $68,000. I moved into a larger apartment, bought actual furniture for the first time in my life, started dating someone named Claire who worked in graphic design and made excellent pasta from scratch. Life was good. Life was genuinely, measurably good. My credit score was 712. My emergency fund had 4 months of expenses in it. I had $18,000 in my Roth IRA. I was 32 years old and I felt, for the first time since childhood, like the ground beneath me was solid. That feeling lasted until October 16, 2018. I remember the date precisely because it was a Tuesday. And Tuesdays were when Claire and I usually cooked dinner together at her apartment. And I had been thinking about that all afternoon, thinking about what we were going to make, whether we had enough garlic, the completely ordinary texture of a good evening. When my phone rang at 4:47 in the afternoon, the number was a 614 area code. Columbus. I answered, assuming it was someone from my parents' world, a neighbor or a contractor, or someone from my father's business. It was not. The man identified himself as Marcus Webb, a senior collections officer at Meridian Capital Recovery, LLC, based in Columbus, Ohio. He asked if he was speaking with Daniel Mercer. I said yes. He said he was calling regarding an outstanding balance on a commercial line of credit, originally issued by First National Business Lending, account number ending in 7742, which had been originated in August of 2014 and had subsequently gone into default. He said the current outstanding balance, including principal, accrued interest, and fees, was $290,412. He asked if I was prepared to discuss repayment options. I said there must be a mistake. He said he understood that was a common first response, and he was happy to give me time to review the documentation. But he wanted to be clear that the account had been open since 2014, that the primary borrower on the account was listed as Robert James Mercer, doing business as Mercer Electric, LLC, and that the co-signer on the account, the person whose signature appeared on the original loan documents, was listed as Daniel Mercer, with my social security number, my date of birth, and my address as of 2014, which had been my Short North apartment. I sat down on the floor of my office. I don't know why. My knees just went and I sat down. I said, I never signed anything. He said, I understand. But the signature on file. I said, I never signed anything for my father's business. I was never asked to. I didn't know this account existed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the measured, neither warm nor cold voice of someone who has heard this many times before. Mr. Mercer, I'd recommend you speak with the primary account holder before we continue this conversation. I can give you 48 hours before we proceed with formal collections activity. I sat on the floor of my office for a long time after that call ended. My coworker Teresa walked by, stopped, looked at me, asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I got up off the floor. I walked to the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like a person who had just been told something that didn't make sense, which is exactly what I was. I called my father at 5:15. He answered on the second ring. His voice was normal, tired, the way it always was in the afternoon, but normal. He asked how I was doing. I said I'd gotten a phone call from a collections agency. He went very quiet, not the quiet of someone who is surprised, the quiet of someone who has been dreading this exact moment for a long time and is now watching it arrive. I asked him about the account. Account number ending in 7742. First National Business Lending. $290,000. He said, I was going to tell you. I asked him when. He said he'd been trying to figure out how to handle it. I asked him when he had opened the account. He said August 2014. I asked him how he had listed me as cosigner without my knowledge or consent. He was quiet again. Then he said, I used a power of attorney. And there it was. The thing that made the room tilt. Because I had, in fact, signed a power of attorney for my father in 2012, the summer I came home after graduation, when he said he might need help managing some business paperwork if he had to travel for a contract bid. It had seemed routine. It had seemed like a formality. A loving, trusting son helping his father with administrative logistics. He had taken that document, that general, broadly worded power of attorney, and 4 years later, without asking me, without telling me, without any conversation or warning, he had used it to sign me onto a $290,000 commercial line of credit that his business could not repay. He had taken the trust I'd handed him in 2012 and used it to bind me to his debt in 2014. And then he had said nothing for 4 years while the balance grew, and the interest compounded, and the business continued to deteriorate, right up until the moment a collections agent called me on a Tuesday afternoon when I was thinking about what to make for dinner. I did not yell at him. I want to be clear about that, because I think people expect that part of the story, the explosion, the screaming, the dramatic confrontation that provides emotional catharsis. It didn't happen that way. I was too stunned to yell. I was in a register beyond anger, in some cold, airless place where the feelings hadn't arrived yet, and all that was left was the bare clinical fact of what had happened. I said, You need to tell me everything. Tonight, he said. I know. I drove to my parents' house that night. My mother was there. She didn't know. I want to be extremely clear about that. My mother did not know about the power of attorney, did not know about the 2014 loan, did not know that her son's name and credit were attached to a defaulting commercial debt. When my father told her, in my presence, at the kitchen table where I had done my homework as a child, she went completely still for about 10 seconds and then said, Robert, what did you do? Not a question, a statement. The kind of statement that only comes after years of smaller revelations, smaller disappointments, smaller instances of finding out that the version of events you'd been given was not the complete one. My father talked for almost 2 hours. The whole story came out, or most of it. The home equity line in 2009, my mother's face when she heard that for the first time. A personal loan from First Ohio Bank in 2011 for $60,000. A smaller line of credit in 2013, and then the big one, the 2014 commercial credit line from First National Business Lending, $290,000, taken out to cover accumulated debt from the earlier loans, to essentially roll everything together and buy time, with me listed as cosigner via the power of attorney I had signed in 2012. The business had been insolvent, effectively, since around 2016. My father had been drawing a salary from it, paying himself a modest income from an account that was fundamentally bankrupt, moving money between accounts to keep various creditors from triggering default clauses, doing what he must have experienced as management, but what was, legally and practically, the prolonged, willful delaying of an inevitable collapse. He had known, at some level, that this call was coming. He had known, at some level, that I would eventually be on the receiving end of it. And he had done nothing. He had continued to show up to family dinners and ask about my job and tell me about his weekends and look me in the eye with the face of a father, the face of a man I trusted completely, while underneath everything there was this thing that had my name on it, gathering interest in the dark. My mother wept at the kitchen table. Not dramatically, just steadily, with the resigned grief of someone processing a sorrow they had suspected for years, but never had confirmed. My father sat with his hands flat on the table and talked and talked, and the more he talked, the smaller he seemed to get, until the man who had once felt to me like weather, immovable, inarguable, simply real, was just a tired 63-year-old sitting in his own kitchen while his family looked at him and understood, all at once, who he actually was. I went home that night and lay in my bed and stared at the ceiling for 6 hours. I didn't sleep. I didn't cry. I just lay there and felt the architecture of my childhood rearranging itself in my mind, every memory being quietly re-examined, recontextualized, placed against this new information and seen differently. The confidence that I had admired was, at least in part, performance. The authority was sometimes just the authority of someone refusing to admit what was happening. The certainty I had found so comforting was, at least partly, the certainty of a man who had decided that managing appearances was the same as managing reality. I am not saying my father was a bad person. I want to be careful here, because the story can easily become a simple villain narrative, and that would be inaccurate and unfair. My father was not evil. He was not malicious in the way that word usually means. He was a proud man who had built something from nothing and could not survive, psychologically, the idea of watching it fall apart. He was a man who had been raised to handle things quietly, to never let anyone see you sweat, to keep your problems inside the house and your face composed in public. He was a man who, at some critical juncture, probably around 2013 or 2014, made a series of desperate decisions born from fear and pride, and the particular blindness that comes from not being able to accept that you are failing. And in making those decisions, he used the trust his son had given him freely. The most unconditional trust I had ever extended to another human being, as a financial instrument. He converted my love into collateral. That is what I cannot forgive. Not the debt, not even the deception entirely, but the specific, deliberate choice to use a power of attorney I had signed in trust, to take my identity and my credit and attach them to his sinking ship, without a single conversation, without a single warning, without one phone call, or one dinner, or one moment of honest acknowledgement that things were bad and he needed help, and could we talk about this together as a family? He chose to protect his pride over protecting his son. He chose appearance over truth, and he chose to let me find out from a stranger. The legal situation was complicated and expensive, and took 2 years to resolve. I want to give you the honest version of what followed, not the sanitized version. I hired an attorney the next morning. Her name was Sandra Okafor, a consumer protection and debt law specialist in Columbus. She charged $350 an hour, and she was worth every single cent. Sandra reviewed the power of attorney I had signed in 2012, reviewed the 2014 loan documents, and told me 2 things. First, the power of attorney I had signed was general in scope, and depending on how First National Business Lending had processed the documentation, it was potentially valid as a basis for the co-signature. Second, there might be grounds to challenge it on the basis of misuse, that the power of attorney had been granted for a specific, limited purpose, and used far beyond that scope without my knowledge or consent. She said it was not a slam dunk. She said it was going to take time and money. She was right on both counts. I also had to manage the immediate credit damage. The account had gone delinquent in early 2018, and by the time I received that call in October, it had been reported to all 3 major credit bureaus, Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion, as a delinquent co-signed account in my name. My credit score dropped from 712 to 544. That score, which I had spent 6 years building carefully and methodically, which I had been proud of, which represented to me something concrete about who I had become as an adult, fell off a cliff in the time it took for a debt to go to collections. Claire and I broke up in January 2019. It is not fair to put all of that on the financial stress, because there were other things, But the financial stress was real, and it was constant, and it came into our relationship in ways that I was not always equipped to handle well. I was angry in a low-grade, persistent way that I didn't always know how to direct, and sometimes I directed it at her, and that was wrong, and I'm sorry for it even now. I borrowed $11,000 from my savings to cover Sandra's initial retainer and early legal fees. I moved out of my larger apartment and into a cheaper one-bedroom in a less desirable part of Columbus. I sold a few things. I did not touch my Roth IRA because Sandra told me to protect it. I ate at home almost entirely for 18 months. I worked overtime when I could get it. I went to sleep most nights running numbers in my head and woke up most mornings running them again. The legal process resolved in November 2020. The outcome was partial. Sandra was able to get Meridian Capital Recovery to release me from the co-signer obligation on the grounds that the power of attorney had been misused, used for a purpose materially different from its stated intent, without my knowledge or consent. First National Business Lending did not contest this aggressively, partly because they had already written much of the debt off and were more interested in pursuing the primary debtor, my father, through other channels. The negative mark on my credit was removed from Experian and TransUnion, but remained on Equifax for an additional 14 months due to a dispute process that I can only describe as Kafkaesque. My final legal bill with Sandra was $31,800. Every dollar of that came out of my savings. My father filed for personal bankruptcy in March 2020. Mercer Electric closed its doors on April 3, 2020, after 31 years of operation. The family home in Dublin, Ohio was sold in a short sale in July 2020 for $240,000 against a mortgage and home equity debt of approximately $310,000. My mother moved into a two-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Columbus near my sister Karen, who by this point had a husband, two children, and a life that had been built at sufficient distance from all of this to have remained largely intact. My relationship with my father now lives in a specific, carefully maintained category of reduced engagement. I see him at holidays when I choose to. I speak to him on the phone occasionally. I have never returned to the way I used to feel about him, and I do not believe I ever will. Because the thing that was lost was not just the money or the credit or the 2 years of legal stress. The thing that was lost was the particular quality of trust that I had for him specifically. The trust that is not just general adult trust, but the specific trust of a child in a parent. The trust that says, this person would not harm me. This person would not use me. This person, if they were drowning, would not grab me and pull me down with them. That kind of trust, once broken in that specific way, does not come back. I have made peace with that. It took time and a therapist and a lot of long runs along the Colorado River, because I eventually moved to Austin in 2021, partly for a better job opportunity and partly for the clean, uncomplicated distance. My credit score as of this year is 731. It took me until 2023 to get back above where it was in October 2018, the day before Marcus Webb called me. My savings are rebuilt. I have a new Roth IRA balance I'm proud of. I have the Honda Civic, the apartment, the dog, the plants. I have a life that I built carefully, methodically, and this time with a very specific understanding that financial trust, even with family, especially with family, must be given consciously and with clear limits. No more open-ended documents signed at a kitchen table, because someone you love asks you to, and you don't know how to say no. I want to talk about the thing that bothers me most. Even now, even with 6 years of distance, it is not the money. The money was terrible, and the legal fees were brutal, and the credit damage was real and lasting. But money is a measurable thing, and measured things can, eventually, be repaired. What bothers me most is the silence. The 4 years of silence between 2014 and 2018. 4 years of family dinners and phone calls and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings, all of it happening while my father knew that my name was on a defaulting debt, that his business was collapsing, that the call was coming. 4 years in which he could have told me. 4 years in which he could have said, Daniel, I need to tell you something. I made a mistake. I used that power of attorney. I'm in trouble. I need your help. Let's figure this out together. He could have said that. The choice not to say it was made over and over again, every day for 4 years, every dinner, every phone call, every moment that passed in which he chose the management of his own discomfort over his son's right to know what was being done in his name. That is what silence costs, not just in dollars. In the specific texture of a relationship, in the particular quality of trust that makes a family feel like more than a group of people who share a last name and show up to the same holidays. I have thought a lot about what my father must have felt during those 4 years. I have tried hard to do this, because I believe that if you refuse to imagine the inner life of someone who has harmed you, you give them a kind of power they don't deserve, the power to remain simply a villain, simple and opaque, rather than becoming what they actually are, which is a complicated person who made specific choices for specific reasons that you can trace and understand even if you cannot forgive them. My father, I think, was terrified. He had built his identity entirely around competence, around being the man who handled things, around never needing help, never admitting weakness, never letting anyone see that he was losing. The idea of telling his family, telling his son that he had failed, that the company was failing, that he had borrowed in secret, and the debts were unpayable, and the whole structure was coming down, was probably more than he could bear to imagine. The conversation would have required him to dismantle the version of himself he had spent 60 years building and maintaining. It would have required him to stand in front of his family as a man who had made serious mistakes and needed help and was asking for that help, rather than managing its effects in secret. He could not do it. He chose, instead, to buy time, to keep kicking the can, to believe, probably sincerely, that he would find a way to fix it before anyone had to know. He ran out of time, as people who kick cans always eventually do. What I want you to take from this story, if you are young, if you are building something, if you have parents who are older and running businesses and sometimes vague about finances, is this: kindness is not the same as blindness. Love is not the same as unconditional financial exposure. The fact that someone is family does not mean that you owe them unlimited trust in matters of money, contracts, and legal liability. We are taught, especially in families like mine, in families where silence is a value and pride is a religion, that asking questions is a form of disloyalty, that checking up on someone you love is a form of distrust, that the appropriate response to a power of attorney request or a loan cosign request from a parent is simply yes, of course, whatever you need, because that is what a good child does. That is a lie. It is a lie that benefits the person with power and harms the person without it. It is a lie that dresses itself up as love and family loyalty and respect for elders, and it has real, documentable, credit bureau visible consequences when it runs into the actual material world. Here is what I know now. If anyone asks you to sign a financial document, you read it. Every word. You ask what it is for, specifically. You set clear limits on what any power of attorney can be used for. You put those limits in writing. You revoke powers of attorney when they are no longer needed. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to say, I love you and I want to help, but I need to understand what I'm signing. Saying that is not a betrayal of your family. It is, in fact, the thing that protects your family, because financial secrecy, financial shame, financial silence, these are the things that destroy families. Not the asking of questions, the keeping of secrets. My father taught me a great deal over the course of my life. He taught me how to work hard. He taught me how to be reliable. He taught me that a handshake is a commitment. He taught me that the quality of your work is a reflection of your character. These are real things, good things, things I still carry. But the most important thing he taught me, the lesson I will carry longer than any other, the lesson written in $31,000 in legal fees and 2 years of rebuilt credit and 6 years of carefully rationed trust. He taught me by negative example, in the most expensive classroom I have ever attended. He taught me that love without honesty is not love. It is management. It is the performance of love while the real thing, the actual thing, the hard thing, is withheld. The real thing would have been a phone call in 2014. The real thing would have been a kitchen table conversation. The real thing would have been, I need help, and I should have asked sooner, and I am asking now because you deserve to know the truth. That would have been love. What actually happened was something else. Something with my name on it that I didn't put there. I am doing fine now. I want to say that clearly, not to wrap things up too neatly, but because it is true and because it matters. I am fine. I am more than fine. I know more about credit law than most people will ever need to know. I know more about powers of attorney, about debt collections processes, about the specific provisions of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act than I ever wanted to. I know what a cosigner liability release looks like and exactly how to request one. I know what an Equifax dispute form looks like at 3 in the morning when you are doing this for the 9th time. I know what it feels like to sit across from a collection agent over the phone and hold your ground when everything in you wants to panic. I know how to check every financial document before I sign it. I know how to trust slowly and verify consistently. I know that the most dangerous trust is the trust that comes from love, because it bypasses all the checkpoints that would otherwise protect you. I know that financial literacy is not just about managing your own money. It is about knowing exactly where your name appears in other people's financial lives and making sure you put it there on purpose. I know what my father's face looked like at the kitchen table that night in October 2018. I know the shape of a man who has run out of time and run out of road and run out of the ability to keep the story going. I know what it looks like when the ceiling of a life that was built on performance finally comes down. I know what the ground looks like when it drops out from under you. And I know, because I have had 6 years to learn it, that you can find it again. The ground. The solid ground. It comes back if you are willing to do the work, if you are willing to ask the hard questions, if you are willing to look clearly at what happened and name it accurately, and not flinch from the naming of it. It comes back, maybe not exactly where it was before, maybe in a different city, with different furniture, with a dog named Biscuit and houseplants that you are mildly surprised to find still alive. But it comes back. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 34 years old. My credit score is 731. Everything on it, I put there myself, and I just want you to know, before you sign anything, before you hand anyone your trust, before you let love stand in for due diligence, I just want you to know what it costs when you don't ask the questions. I want you to know what it costs when you assume the person responsible is handling it. I want you to know what it sounds like when a stranger calls you on a Tuesday afternoon and tells you that you owe $290,000 on a debt you never knew existed. I want you to know that so you never, ever have to find out for yourself. Protect your name, protect your credit, protect your future, even from the people you love, especially from the people you love. Because love does not appear on your credit report. But your name does. And once someone puts it somewhere you didn't mean for it to be, the only person who has to live with that, the only person standing in the office bathroom at 5 in the afternoon, running cold water over their wrists, and looking in the mirror at a life they have to now somehow rebuild, is you, just you. Make sure your name is only where you put it. That is the whole lesson. That is everything. That is the thing my father, in all his competence, and all his pride, and all his desperate, suffocating silence, never managed to teach me on purpose. I learned it anyway. The hard way is still a way. There is something I have not told you yet. Something that took me a long time to be able to say out loud, to myself and to anyone else. Something that sits at the center of this whole story in a way that the financial details, as real and damaging as they were, don't fully capture. And that thing is grief. Not the grief of losing money. Not the grief of losing credit score points, or 2 years of forward momentum, or the apartment I liked. The grief of losing a father. Not to death, but to the particular kind of loss that comes from finally understanding who someone actually is and realizing it is not who you thought. That grief is its own category. It does not have a name in our culture, not really. We have words for what happens when a parent dies. We have rituals, funerals, casseroles from neighbors, a week off work, a socially recognized process for mourning. But we have no language for what happens when a parent is still alive and still sitting across from you at the holiday table, and yet something essential between you is simply gone. Something you cannot get back and cannot pretend to have. There is no casserole for that. There is no week off work. You just carry it, mostly in silence, which is perhaps the most Mercer thing about this whole story. I carried it for a long time before I talked to anyone about it. My therapist's name is Ellen. She is 61 years old. She has short gray hair and reading glasses she is always pushing up her nose. And she has an office in South Austin with a small waterfall feature in the corner that I initially found irritating and eventually found necessary. I started seeing her in 2021 when I moved to Austin, when I had enough physical and emotional distance from everything that I could finally begin to look at it directly without flinching away. In our sessions, early on, I kept wanting to focus on the mechanics of what happened, the legal details, the financial timeline, the specific sequence of decisions my father had made. Ellen kept gently pulling the conversation back to something else. Not what happened, but what it felt like to have it happen. Not the debt, but the relationship. Not the credit score, but the trust. It took months before I could talk about the trust without my voice doing a thing I didn't like. Before I could say, plainly, I trusted him completely. I trusted him the way you trust someone who has never given you a reason not to, who has always shown up, who has always been what they appeared to be, or so you believed. I trusted him the way you trust the floor when you step out of bed in the morning. Without checking, without verifying, because it has always been there, and you see no reason to doubt it. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, the floor was just gone, and I was falling, and the falling was all the worse because I had not seen it coming, and had not been prepared because I had not been the kind of person who prepared for floors to disappear. Ellen asked me once whether I was angry. I said of course I was angry. She asked me what the anger felt like. I said it felt like being cheated in a game I didn't know I was playing. She said that was interesting. She said, it sounds like the betrayal is less about the money and more about the asymmetry. That he knew things you didn't know, things that directly concerned you, things with your name on them, and he chose to keep knowing them alone rather than share that knowledge with you. I said yes. That was exactly it. It was this asymmetry. He was sitting across from me for 4 years, knowing what he knew, and I was sitting across from him, thinking we were having the same conversation, thinking we were on the same ground, thinking the table between us was level. It was not level. It was never level. He had information that changed the entire nature of our relationship, and he kept it. And I didn't know I was operating in the dark, and that is the thing. That is the thing that I still feel when I think about it too long. There is something specifically disorienting about being deceived by a parent. Not because parents are perfect. Intellectually, I have always known that parents are fallible, human, capable of bad decisions and worse ones. but there is a pre-intellectual understanding laid down in early childhood before you have the cognitive apparatus to evaluate it, that parents are safe, that they are on your side in the most fundamental possible way, that their interests and yours are aligned, that the relationship between a parent and a child is at its root the relationship between someone who has more power and someone who has less power, and the person with more power has agreed, has implicitly, constitutively agreed, to use that power in your service rather than against you. When that agreement is broken, the damage is not just emotional, it is architectural. It reaches back through memory and rewires things. It makes you look at the past differently, and look at the future with new wariness, and look at every relationship with a slightly colder eye. I do not think that is entirely bad. The slightly colder eye. I am not the person I was before October 2018, and I do not want to be. That person was trusting in ways that were not wisdom, but naivety dressed up as loyalty. That person believed that being a good son meant asking no questions and extending infinite trust and treating the family patriarch's judgment as weather, inarguable, real, simply there. That person signed a power of attorney at a kitchen table because he loved his father and his father asked him to, and it didn't occur to him to ask what exactly it would be used for. I am something different now. Not harder, exactly. I am still a person who loves people and trusts them and tries to show up for them. But the trust is conscious now. It is chosen rather than automatic. It is given in increments rather than all at once. And each increment is contingent on it being honored. This is, I think, how trust is supposed to work between adults. I just had to learn it the very expensive way. My sister Karen and I talk more than we used to. This is one of the few things that came out of all of this that I would categorize as unambiguously good. Before 2018, Karen and I had the mild, slightly dutiful relationship of siblings who love each other but live separate lives and don't have a great deal to say to each other beyond holiday logistics and occasional life updates. After 2018, after we both found ourselves trying to process what our father had done and what it meant, and how we felt about it, and who he actually was, and who our family actually was, we started talking more. Real talking. The kind that doesn't happen over holiday dinner, but happens on the phone at 10 at night when the kids are asleep, and both of you have permission to say the true things. Karen is more forgiving of our father than I am. This is not a criticism. It is just a different position, and I think it comes from a slightly different vantage point. Karen is married. Her finances were never directly threatened. She was not the one who received the phone call. She was not the one who hired the attorney. Her relationship with our father has a different wound in it, and the wound heals differently. She still has dinner with him regularly. She still calls him on his birthday. She brings the grandchildren over. She has found a way to hold both things simultaneously, his failure and his fatherhood, in a way that I have not fully managed yet. I respect that. I am still working on my version of it. I spoke to my father on the phone on his birthday this past year. The call lasted 12 minutes. It was careful and polite. He asked about my job. I asked about his health. He mentioned he'd seen a Cardinals game on television and thought of me because I'd been a Cardinals fan as a kid and wasn't anymore, which somehow struck me as both a very Mercer thing to say and quietly heartbreaking. At the end of the call, he said, "I'm sorry, Daniel." He says it sometimes, in that register, not in the middle of a conversation about it, but as a kind of coda, a separate sentence dropped at the end of something else, and I never quite know what to do with it. I said, "I know, Dad," which is what I always say, because I do know. I believe he is sorry, I believe he carries it. But I also know that being sorry and being trustworthy are different things. And being sorry does not restore what the silence took from us. And being sorry does not change what he chose over 4 years of Tuesday evenings. Being sorry is a beginning. It does not foreclose all the other things. I want to tell you something about money and family that nobody told me and that I wish someone had. Money is not separate from love. We are taught, in a lot of families, to treat these as different categories. Love is emotional, money is practical, and mixing them is somehow vulgar or suspicious. This is deeply wrong, and the wrongness has consequences. Money is where values show up in the real world. Money is where choices become concrete. When someone uses your financial trust against you, they are not just committing a financial act. They are telling you something about who you are to them, about your place in their priorities, about the specific arithmetic of what matters when things get hard and choices have to be made. My father's financial choices were emotional choices. The decision to use my power of attorney rather than ask for my help was a decision about the relationship between his pride and my well-being. And his pride won. That is information. It cost me a great deal to receive it, but it is real information about a real person, and I have the right to act on it. I think about the young people who will hear this story, or stories like it, because my story is not unique, not by a long way. I have found communities online of people who have been co-signed onto debt without knowledge, who have had their credit damaged by parents or spouses or siblings, who have signed documents in trust that were later used against them. The specific mechanisms differ, but the shape of the story is consistent. There is love, there is trust, there is financial crisis, there is silence. There is a decision made by one party that affects the other profoundly without their knowledge. And then there is the moment of discovery. And then there is the long, unglamorous, expensive work of recovery. The story is not rare. The story is just rarely told plainly. Because the financial betrayal by a family member sits at the intersection of shame and money and family loyalty, which are three of the most powerful silencing forces in human culture, and the combination of them is enough to keep most people quiet indefinitely. I am not quiet about it. Not anymore. I am not quiet about it because silence is what made this possible. My father's silence. His silence for 4 years. And before that, the broader family silence. The Mercer value of keeping things inside, handling things privately, never showing weakness, never asking for help, never letting anyone see the real numbers. That silence had been building for a generation before it deposited $290,000 on my doorstep. And if I maintain that silence now, if I treat this story as something private and shameful that should stay inside the house, I am continuing the exact tradition that caused the damage in the first place. So, I tell it. I tell it to friends when they are about to sign documents for families for fair reading members, without reading them. I tell it to colleagues when they mention that a parent has asked them to co-sign something and they're not sure they feel comfortable saying no, but don't want to seem disloyal. I tell it here, now, to you, whoever you are, wherever you are in your life. Whether you have been through something like this, or you are standing upstream of it. In the period before the call comes, in the period when everything still seems solid. Please read what you sign. Please ask what power of attorney will be used for. Please set explicit limits on financial authority that you grant to anyone, regardless of how much you love them. Please understand that the most dangerous financial exposure is not the exposure that comes from your own bad decisions, but the exposure that comes from trusting someone else's decisions when you don't have the information to evaluate them. Please understand that financial transparency in families, real transparency, not the managed, curated version where things are fine, we're handling it, don't worry, is not a violation of intimacy. It is the foundation of it. Real intimacy requires truth. Truth in families requires the courage to say, I am struggling, I need help, I have made mistakes. Here is what the situation actually looks like. That courage is rare. It was rare in my family. It may be rare in yours. But the absence of it has a price, and that price does not stay contained to the person who chose silence. It spreads. It shows up in credit reports and legal fees and late-night phone calls and 12-minute birthday conversations full of careful politeness. It shows up in the specific quality of grief that has no casserole and no week off work. It shows up in the architecture of trust, in the way a grown man walks through the world now with a slightly colder eye that was not always there. That price was too high. It did not have to be paid this way. It could have been a kitchen table conversation in 2014. It could have been my father saying, "Son, I am in trouble, and your name is about to be on something I should have asked you about, and I need you to understand what has happened and help me figure out what to do." That conversation would have cost us something. Pride, maybe. The performance of competence. The image of the patriarch who handles things. But those are things worth losing. Those are things that should have been surrendered long before the debt collector called. I think, in the quieter moments, my father knows this. I think he has sat with the specific weight of that Tuesday afternoon more times than I can count. In the way that people sit with the moments of their lives that they cannot take back. I think he has gone over it again and again. The choice not to tell me, the choice to use the power of attorney, the choice to let 4 years pass in silence. I think he has felt the weight of it. I hope he has, anyway. Not out of cruelty. Not because I want him to suffer, but because the alternative, that he has not fully reckoned with it, that he carries it lightly or not at all, would mean something about the nature of the persons I am still, despite everything, trying to maintain some kind of relationship with. The last thing I want to say is about rebuilding, about what it actually looks like from the inside, the long project of putting back together what got taken apart. It is not dramatic. It is not a montage. It is a lot of spreadsheets, and a lot of budget reviews, and a lot of phone calls to credit bureaus, and a lot of hours with Sandra Okafor, and a lot of evenings looking at numbers until you know them by heart, and a lot of mornings where you just get up and do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. It is moving to a new city and learning new streets and finding a running trail by the river and getting a dog and naming him Biscuit because he is the color of a biscuit and he is ridiculous and perfect and has never once deceived you about anything. It is finding out that the ground comes back, not the same ground, different ground. Ground you built yourself this time, with full knowledge of what it's made of and who has access to it. Ground with no one else's name on it. Ground that is yours. That ground is better. It is harder and it cost more and it took longer and it required things I would not have chosen to go through. But it is mine in a way that the earlier ground never fully was. The earlier ground that I inherited and stood on and trusted without examination. This ground I built stone by stone, with clear eyes, with specific knowledge of what goes into it and what doesn't. With a lawyer I trust, and a therapist I trust, and a dog who trusts me back, with the magnificent, uncomplicated, entirely non-financial trust of a creature who just wants to be near you and doesn't know anything about powers of attorney. 731. That is my credit score. Every point of it I put there myself. Every account on my report I opened with intention. Every payment I made on time because I chose to make it. There is nothing on my financial record that I didn't put there. That is the whole story. Protect your name. It's the only one you have.